Hello and welcome to Ask an Author with Julia Kelly. I am really thrilled today. We have a fantastic interview with an author whose book I just read and absolutely loved, Erika Robuck. It's very nice to meet you and have you on the show.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Can you tell me a little bit about this fantastic book? Set it up for us because I know my readers are going to be really, really excited about this one.
Well, it's really about a real life superwoman from World War II, a woman who was recruited and trained by intelligence organizations to make life hell for Nazis.
So this is Virginia Hall, and she is sort of one of those women whose names you hear thrown about a little bit, kind of if you know about World War II. But I don't think I've seen a novel that goes this in depth into part of her life. What was it about her that drew you to this idea originally?
I really like to write about women from areas where I'm familiar. We both grew up in Baltimore and had a lot in common with our backgrounds, and that's where it splits apart. Because then she obviously she spoke 5 languages, she traveled the world, she became a spy. I didn't, but I was fascinated by her courage and her daring. And the more I read about her, the more I knew her story had to be told. Because when I started writing the book, there was almost nothing. But then, as the collective unconscious picks up on things, all of a sudden there's a new biography, there's a movie called A Spy, there's this. So it really starts coming up, a comic book, so it's,
That's exciting.
yeah, yeah.
So, where in her life do we meet her in The Invisible Woman? Because she has a really fascinating and complex life.
Yeah, so the book takes place in a pretty tight timeline in the weeks leading up to and after D-Day during her second mission in occupied France. But it took me hundreds of pages to realize that's where the novel started because I had begun back with her first mission at the beginning of the war. I'd woven her story with another secret agent. I had done all kinds of things until I finally realized the story began when she went back with a price on her head in disguise, and the questions I kept asking were, why would she do it? How could she do it? And what was her motivation?
So it's funny, one of the things that I wrote down to ask you was, why do you think she did go back? Because I know you do touch on that first mission in the book, and it's woven through flashbacks and memories and various things. What is it that you think compelled her to be parachuted? Or, I'm sorry, not parachuted. She was dropped off in a rowboat, right?
Mhm.
Back into France when it was really such a dangerous mission for her and such a dangerous time in general.
Well, and yeah, she couldn't get parachuted the way other agents were because she had a prosthetic leg. And so that made things even more complicated. But for me, what I kept coming back to when I read her war reports and different psychological questionnaires that she'd gotten, it became pretty clear to me that she had a fairly high degree of post traumatic stress. I don't know how she couldn't, but also she had a healthy dose of survivor guilt because her first network, a betrayer, had infiltrated his way into that network. Um, Through in part because of her allowing him in, but she had a lot of red flags. She kept alerting headquarters in London, there's something that's not right, and they kept saying his bona fides check out. So there was this strange time where she wasn't so sure about him, and ultimately enough people said he's fine to let him in, and because of that, it destroyed her first network, and it resulted in people being taken to concentration camps, people being murdered. And then ultimately, she had to escape over the Pyrenees in November with a prosthetic leg to escape. They were all hot on her trail. So all of that was her motivation for going back, because not necessarily to avenge them, but to see the work through, to help the war end. She became a wireless operator, which is something she wasn't during her first mission. It took a specialized degree of training. She wanted to be able to communicate directly without having to rely on yet another layer of personnel. And she really wanted to do everything she can to beat the Nazis. And while she was there, she still didn't know for sure who the betrayer was when she left. She had a good idea, but she also wanted to gather a little more intelligence to see if she could bring justice to him.
So there's a personal mission there in terms of this previous group that she had led in Lyon, right?
Yes. And her boss with the special operations executive, Vera Atkins, didn't want her to go back because there was a wanted poster, and Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, was after her. And so she ended up switching over to the OSS, which was the US counterpart, and working with Wild Bill Donovan. And he was happy to send anybody who wanted to go. He was a rebel too. And, the British are, there's a lot of polish. They called their spy network the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, where the Americans, they were up for disguises and dirty tricks. They called themselves the Department of Dirty Tricks. So she had to go into full disguise, even change her fillings so that they were gold in the French way. And really take on the identity of an old woman so that she could become invisible.
It's so interesting that you bring up the differences between the American and the British approach to spycraft, because one of the things that really struck me while reading this book was how, in some ways, she's so brutal, and in some ways, she's so tender in different aspects of her life. And it makes for such a complex, rich character. And I think it's so much more compelling reading a book about a person like that rather than somebody who's completely cut and dry, heroic or evil, I suppose.
Yeah.
Definitely, she's really, really interesting as a character. Can you talk a little bit about building that complexity into her character when you approach this book?
Sure, that was one of the greatest challenges. And a lot of my beta readers told me she is just not likable. I can't align myself with her. Could you make her more motherly? I said, but she wasn't. Her niece told me that she was intimidating and scary smart, and she had contentious relationships with some of the Maquis that she worked with, the guerrilla fighters. Nobody ever called her likable or motherly. But they did have a deep respect for her. And once she could let down her veneer, she became very, very attached to the people in her networks. And it was something she actually had to fight within herself because of what had happened in Lyon and how heartbroken she was. And one of the things my editor actually suggested this, and it was very helpful, was to show Virginia in a prologue when she's a young woman and she falls in love with Paris, and she has the whole world ahead of her. This is before she had the hunting accident that took her foot. This is before the war losses. So we get to see some of her youth and exuberance, and then transition directly into when she arrives on the beach in France during her second mission, just a cold shell of her former self. So that hopefully the reader, says, gosh, what happened to her? And that question carries on through.
I definitely want to ask you about your research and speaking to her niece at some point. But before that, can we talk a little bit about some of the characters that you build out in the story who, create her world? Because I think her attachments to those people are obviously very deep, but clearly this is a really dangerous time and there's not a lot of trust to go around. So how did you kind of populate the world with people around her?
Well, I started with all the known people who had a full story that I could tap into, and selected the ones that I knew the most about, that I could create the largest characters around. So for example, if we get closer to one of the last stops in the book at Les Chambons sur Lignon, there were 5 men in the Lebrat family, and they all worked at different aspects of the guerrilla work and the undercover work, but I couldn't have 5 men with the last name Lebrat, so I chose one of them. So I have made Edmund the representative for the family. So sometimes, that's where the fiction come in. I have to do things like that. But on the other hand, then we have the family of Mimi and Lavalette and their son Gerard. I know there was a lot known about them. So I was able to use that and show a family and the resistance work that they did, even with a little child in his wagon, how that contributed to the effort. Further back, some of the peasants from the beginning who were executed. Virginia Hall had written about them in a letter to someone after the war. I think it was home to her mom. But she never named them, and I wasn't able to find out their exact identity. So I took what I knew, and then I filled in. So there's some people are people that I had to construct, others are real. And then in the author's note, that's where I confess all of my writer sins and tell how I combined 6 people into one and so forth.
But this is the tension of writing historical fiction, right? Especially I imagine writing about a real person and with real, secondary characters, is there's a question of how much history do you want in there to make sure it's accurate, and then how much fiction do you want to put in there to make sure that the reader can follow it and can follow the narrative also.
Yeah, and that's something I'm sure you deal with too, is, constructing a novel, but also being faithful to the time and what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that was really striking about this book was the world building that you did as well, bringing us into France in 1944 and what it would have been like living there. Can you talk about some of the touches that you added to make it feel like, we sort of understood what these people would have been going through and what their life would have been like?
Sure. While there wasn't a lot directly about Virginia Hall, there's a lot written about the time period. So, there's just tons and tons of resources. So, I did extensive research reading. I wasn't able to go to France, especially during the pandemic, but I was able to. This sounds silly, but the Nordic track in my basement has a video screen where you can plug in locations. So I was able to walk Lyon and the Trebles there near there, and I was able to walk over the Pyrenees, just kind of see the lay of the land. So that helped a little bit.
Cooler version of the Google Streets thing that everybody talks about.
Yeah, it's great. And also, if you go on YouTube, and I put in tour of Les Chambons sur Lignon, and there's videos and people walking through the town. So if you can't get there, those are really helpful. Of course, she grew up in Baltimore, and I've been to her homes here where she grew up. I could see all that, but it wasn't a huge part of the novel. That was all sort of backstory.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about, and I'm going to mess up the name, I suspect, but Le Charbon sur Lyon, is that right?
Yes,
Can you
yes.
talk a bit about why that's a unique place and the role that it plays in this book and in the greater war history?
Absolutely. That was a treasure that I discovered well into the writing of the book. Um, I didn't understand exactly why it was so important that Virginia get to that region and what was going on there. And when I did, I was just, again, this novel, if I'd made it up, you wouldn't believe it. But Les Chambon, which is the abbreviated way of saying it, and all of the villages around them harbored Jewish children, every single house in the region, and it was a largely Protestant region. These guides would bring Jewish orphaned children from all over Europe, and each family had at least one child staying with them, really thousands of them. And they didn't ask for anything. Very often, they didn't have a lot of extra rations or anything like that. They just folded them into their farms, their homes in the city and the country. And that destination was a place that people traveled to for their health sometimes. So the writer Camus actually spent time in Les Chambons sur Lignon getting better. And it was a place people traveled for that reason. And there were some schools there. So they were able to put the Jewish children as French children in these schools. And that's why they could have dozens and dozens of them walking through town. And they taught them the French songs, and they taught them some of the things that they would need to blend in, but they also helped preserve their identity, preserve their faith. They didn't try to convert them. They just cared for them. Some of the children went through over the border with the Swiss Red Cross. Some of them stayed. And it was an unbelievable effort in cooperation. And they had very few issues. They had very few raids. They did have some, but not a lot. And that was especially extraordinary because there was a German rehabilitation hospital on Main Street in town. So it's all that was going on with Nazi soldiers there constantly. So
It's one of the really striking things in the book, I think, is when you paint the picture of this town having this hospital and the very present threat of that, especially to the adults in the book, along with these children that you see throughout, this section of the book, walking through the streets and being cared for in their schools. And, Virginia does, of course, become involved in small ways with that as well. And she sees some of the efforts firsthand. But it's really striking how these children were hidden right under Nazi noses and successfully able to survive the war that way.
yeah, and the children, many of them didn't even understand when they were in danger. They had a series of calls from village to village. So one village would call and say there's a patrol coming, and they would call right on up through the mountain towns. And then the teachers would take the children to the forest and tell them, oh, we're going to pick mushrooms. And they would take them out for a few hours and then bring them back. And many of the children had no idea that they were in danger during that time. And these children, many of them suffered severe trauma. They weren't separated from their parents in a gentle way. And so the way that the villagers and the teachers rallied around to make these children have as safe and healthy a life as possible, it was so moving to find it. and to see it. And they didn't want any recognition for it. So it's almost like you have to whisper because they still don't want recognition. When you ask some of the villagers, you see there's documentaries and different videos, and when people say, how could you do this? And they are like, what else would I do? My neighbor needed help. Okay.
Just so simple in some ways, but obviously such a great, risk at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to be sure that that you guys who are watching know that you can absolutely ask questions, and I'll be keeping an eye on comments if you see me looking down. But before we went up, we actually had a question from Arlene, who asks, "What did you learn about yourself in writing this book? What were the most challenging and inspiring parts for you in the writing process?"
I learned that I am every bit a coward and a wimp as I thought I was. I read the things that
Just confirmed that.
just confirmed it, when I'm grumpy because my brand of pasta isn't at the grocery store. I just remember how bad it could actually be. But not to be silly, but it is a good dose of perspective, especially in the time that we live in. And, people call these unprecedented times, and they're very strange and they're very different. But, I think any of us who've researched World War II know it could get much worse. So it's a nice dose of perspective of it's going to be okay. Also, I was so moved by what people do well. So Virginia Hall is not especially relatable to the average person because of her level of courage and strength and intelligence. But the people she worked with in the networks were just farmers and teachers, moms and dads. And they were ordinary people that wherever they could help, however they helped, they did. And that made them great people. So it was nice to see that and to recognize, to highlight some of the everyday people in the war who don't have statues, who don't have biographies, but should be recognized.
So what were some of the ways that those people contributed? Because it is pretty extraordinary, the lengths that people were willing to go, not just in the towns hiding children, but also some of the really active spy work that they were involved with.
Yeah, well, when I'm thinking of the family in one of the villages, that the father was a French gendarme. He was a police officer, and the police had to cooperate with the Nazis. But he was a double agent. He worked with them, and then he also had bands of Maquis out in the woods that he helped take care of, train, help house, find food for. So he was just walking this tightrope all the time in an incredibly dangerous position. His wife, she would harbor resistors. She would be a courier to take messages different places. And their son, their 9-year-old son, they really would load his wagon full of weapons, and he would take them down to the river where someone would get them in the boat and move them other places. So that to me was the most striking example of, a family that was all in.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really astonishing when you realize just how involved the children can be in these circumstances. And I think one of the things that really comes out in the book also is how young some of the resistance fighters were as well.
Yes.
To the point where she sort of almost thinks about them as her boys, but not in a mothering sort of way. It's more of almost like a sister or aunt relationship, isn't it?
It is, and some of them even called her auntie, which was, and that was silly because he was just 7 years younger than she was. But when she came in France, when you turned 17, you were automatically conscripted for the STO. You had to work for the Nazis. So these boys that were 16, about to turn 17, would head for the woods as soon as it was their birthday came, and they all became these vigilante outlaws. And, I have 3 sons. I have a 13-year-old, a 16-year-old, and an 18-year-old. And 16-year-old boys are unruly, so then you have them out in the woods waiting, and not a lot of food, not a lot of entertainment, and getting themselves into trouble sometimes. That, like Chambon-sur-Lignon, they would injure each other. They would play knife games and wrestle, so the village doctor is having to see to them in addition to people who are hiding. So it was just interesting to see that. But really, that's where Virginia felt best. She was very afraid when she was with families with children. She didn't want anything to do with that because she knew the danger it brought to them by housing her. But if she had a bunch of young men out in the woods, it was more like a platoon. It was an army, and that she felt better with because it wasn't, her no nonsense personality went pretty far there.
Yeah, I can imagine it. I imagine it would be. And they seem to certainly respond to that. I mean, the respect that you talked about earlier, even when people are waiting, even when people are doubtful about, the British coming through or the Americans coming through with drops, it seems like she retains this sort of center for all these people, and they can rely on her.
Yes, and it was always a challenge, especially disguised as an old woman, to get them to trust her and respect her and to know that she was going to train them to blow things up and defend villages. But she always managed to do it. And that was one of the reasons that her recruiters, it was one of the things they acknowledged throughout her time with her evaluations, was that she had a great knack for getting people to trust her and then to become loyal to her very quickly. So she was able to do that very well.
So I would love to learn a little bit more about your research process, because it sounds like you did an incredible amount of research for this book, not just on Virginia Hall, but also on the surrounding areas. So perhaps you can talk a little bit about how you dug into this story.
Sure. Yeah, I always start with whatever I can get my hands on easily. So any biographies. With spies, it's not as easy to find a full biography on a single person. Normally, it's a mention within a book about female spies or spies in this region. Yeah. So it's putting together all of the puzzle pieces, which I love the process. I have a great time with that. And then because I do live in Maryland, the National Archives in College Park are nearby, and that's where all of the declassified files of the OSS are. So I was able to go through Virginia's declassified files from her time during the war. There's still a lot that is classified because she was in the CIA and operative until her mandatory retirement at the age of 60. So, but everything that I needed, I had access to. And then I applied to be a researcher at the CIA in McLean, Virginia. So I was able to spend the day there going through the museum. I saw her Distinguished Service Cross, her passport, wireless transceiver, and then this painting, The Daisies Will Bloom at Night by Jeffrey Bass, which has Virginia on her wireless in a barn with one of the Labrats, Edmund. That's why I picked him, because he's pictured there, transmitting. So it was a really great day. But the best of all the research was visiting with her niece, Lorna. Lorna still lives in Baltimore, and I called her up. Her name, I got in touch with her, and she was happy to meet me. She had met with me for lunch over several occasions. And the first time I went to her house, she pulled out this huge box, and it was full of photographs that I'd never seen before. And they were from Virginia growing up. She called her Aunt Dindy, or everybody called her Dindy in the family. But so she showed me all of these pictures. And in those, it wasn't the Virginia Hall that I knew, this woman of steel who was, in charge of everything. It was Virginia at the farm dressing up with like a bird on her head, or surrounded in dogs, or laughing with her brother, climbing a tree, sailing. It was a really relaxed and personal view of her. So it was great to see that.
Wonderful. That sounds like an absolutely incredible opportunity to, again, get that kind of other side that you wouldn't necessarily see portrayed if you're looking just at the snapshot of her life within the war, because that's what people are most interested in.
Yes, but we have to know everything just to give the tip of the iceberg. So
exactly. Well, I imagine with so I cheat a little bit, and I will base characters around aspects of real people, but they're never real people. So there must be an extra layer of I don't know if it's responsibility or pressure, maybe when we're about a real person.
Yes, and I can't share exactly publicly what she said, but Lorna emailed me earlier this week, and she loved the book. So that was just the very best. I care what everybody thinks about it, but I mostly cared what Lorna thought. So
I imagine you want to get that one right.
It was very moving to see her words about that. So thank goodness Lorna approves.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that. You seem to be drawn to writing about real people across all of your books. I was looking at your book list earlier, a few of which I have on my TBR. What is it about writing about real life people and putting them into novels that you think is compelling, or that you find yourself particularly drawn to?
Well, years ago, the first time I read The Girl with the Pearl Earring, I was fascinated by how Tracy Chevalier looked at a painting and only knew a little bit about the person in it, but created a whole world around it. And I just became sort of enthralled with that manner of doing things. And then I love research. I love uncovering stories. And I like to do it for people who people don't necessarily know a lot about, because it brings them, to the forefront. And I've been writing about women in the shadows of American writers for a long time. Mm-hmm. And an editor had said to me, why not write about a woman who's remarkable in her own right, not Mrs. or daughter of or girl of, but somebody who's great. And that's about the time that Virginia Hall came on my radar. So, she also was in the shadows, but for different reasons.
Sure, for secretive, clandestine reasons, I imagine.
Yeah.
Was there was it different writing the feeling of writing about a woman who, again, we wouldn't know in history because of her association with a man, but in her own right?
Yes, and she really, I still get the sense that she didn't necessarily want to be found. So it was the most challenging book I've ever had to write, trying to find her and then trying to find which part of her story to tell. It was quite a labor of love. But it's funny. I think that she didn't want to be found, but I think she would be happy with how it all came out, especially because all of these stories about her are now bubbling to the surface. So hopefully she would be honored by it.
Absolutely. One question from Christine is there something in your research that shocked you about her?
Well, I'm not necessarily about her, but it shocked me in my research, the depth of cruelty, humanity to humanity. I didn't even begin to comprehend. I, of course, have seen and read 1,000 things about World War II, but when you dig into the stories about the levels of cruelty and reprisal, it was just. That was another reason why it was the hardest book I've ever written, because it gave me nightmares. It was just, there's some of the things are just inhuman. So it was a shock to read some of the things I did.
Yeah, I imagine it even when you close the laptop and try to stop for the day, it stays with you.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. I wanted to ask a little bit about your writing process, because that's always a popular topic of conversation, kind of getting a behind the scenes look at what writing is like. Do you have a writing routine, or are you sort of writing when inspiration hits you?
No, I definitely have a routine, and you have to be in the chair for inspiration to come flitting by. It's a
I
fickle, it's so fickle. So I always, I typically work when my kids are in school, either in line or in person. So most of the time, everyone's out of the house by about 9. So I'll write from 9 to 1, just about every day. So I'm either revising or writing during that time, and then after that, lunch, exercise, get kids, do all that kind of stuff. But it's every day. During the week. And so I would say Monday through Thursday is a slog, and I'm second guessing everything and deleting as much as I've written. But then on the 5th day, that's when you hit the zone. And all of a sudden, it's like the radio frequency, the static goes away, you're tuned into the channel, and 4 hours go by and you don't know what happened. You don't even have to edit. It's perfect. So always chasing that day, but it is few and far between.
I know that feeling. I know that feeling. I find that those moments when you can hit those, really good, couple thousand word or more days are just, you're happy when they come, because they don't always come as a guarantee.
They don't, no, not at all.
I think one of the things that I always get asked, and I'm always curious to hear about, is what do you do when it is a slog and it is tough to make your way through? I don't know if you have a set word count or a set amount of time that you're making yourself sit down every day, and that's sort of dictating it, or if deadlines dictate that. But how do you get through those times where you think, "Ugh, the words just aren't coming"?
Well, I think because I've written so many books at this point, I trust the process. So I don't push too hard on those days, because the resistance usually is sending me a message. So I try to look back at research, or I'll go back and edit things I've already written, or I'll write a scene that's completely in a different part of the book. I don't necessarily have to write in order. So I will hop to something else if I can see it more clearly that day. And sometimes the work does say just stop and go away. So I won't write that day and then come back to it with fresh eyes another day. And usually that helps me work out whatever problem there is. But with writing, I know there's always something to be done. So this book is finished, but it's being promoted. And then my next book, my revisions are due next Friday. So I'm working that in through all of this. And then I'm always researching whatever the next book is going to be. So I'm reading articles, I'm reading books, and there's always something to be doing. So I don't ever just sit there and say, oh, what could I do today? Usually there's something I could be doing.
Do you have an idea bank that you're pulling from for those next books, or the next book maybe in the future? Or do you sort of have to take in a lot of things and then something will bubble up to the surface?
Well, I'm always, my radar is always there, and I get ideas and I'll send myself an email or a note. And then actually it's right here. I have this little box, and I write them, all the slips of paper are in here. And I just go through it when I'm on to my next book. And a lot of times it'll rise out of this box. It's just sitting there stewing and brewing right now.
Yeah, it's like it's out of your mind, so you don't have to think about it immediately, but it's still there.
Yeah, definitely.
I love that idea. I might borrow that from you. All my great ideas about how to write have come from other people. So
there you go. Yeah, it's just great. I know that right there, I feel like it's working, even though I'm not. So when whatever's on the top, maybe the papers will readjust themselves. I don't know.
Exactly. So I hate to ask about the pandemic, but it is something that obviously is front of mind for so many of us, and it's changed a lot of how we're living our lives. Has it changed your writing routine, or has it changed sort of how you're able to go about writing?
It has. I'm very fortunate because my sons are older, so they, even though they've been home so much, for the most part they're self-sufficient. You know, there are different interruptions, but when they're school day, they can see to their own school day online, their own schoolwork. So that's been great. In the beginning, I was horrified because I thought, you know, I need isolation, I need silence, I need all of these things, and I realized over the course of the last year, well, I can't have them. So what am I going to do? Am I not going to write? So I still always use classical music. So instead of just playing it on the computer, I'll put my earbuds in and help to get in the zone that way. So it's made me more flexible. I think it's certainly not ideal, but you know, it works. It works. You just have to focus.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. Have you been able to rely on a writer community, or have you, I know different writers have different approaches to things. So some people are very involved with a writing group and lots of critique partners and things like that. And some people are a little bit more, you know, you have friends who are writers, but it's not necessarily as much of a day-to-day in your writing process.
Yeah, I have a group of people who I talk to all the time about the process, and they're all in different places. Some of them are best-selling novelists, some of them are quietly self-publishing poetry, some, you know, it's just all different kinds of people that I'll talk to about different problems in the manuscript or have them read a section. But it's been a long time since I've had a critique partner. My critique partner I used to work with all the time was someone I've been friends with since childhood, but our lives have both gotten so busy we can't exchange as often as we like. Yeah. But now I rely on when I finally get that first draft done, I rely on my agent to go for the first deep dive and to give me any feedback. And then with my editor, just so fantastic. So I have a really nice publishing community to help with that.
Wonderful. We have a question from Dorothy who asks, do you have an outline so you can skip ahead? Talking about, you know, those moments where maybe you go to a different scene because you see that a bit clearer.
Yes, what I do is I make a timeline. So once I know the part of the history I'm going to be working with, I have a timeline, and then I let the story kind of flow within that. It's not a detailed outline the way some people might think about it, but I have years and scenes pretty much laid out. And then within that, the flexibility for the characters to make the scenes unfold as they will.
Mm-hmm. So a little bit of the unknown, but a little bit of a plan along the way.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that sounds very familiar. I like that. I like that.
Yeah, you do? Yeah.
I do. I used to be very, you know, very by the seat of my pants. And then I realized that I can't at this point in my career afford to spend 40,000 words to figure out what I want to write about. So yeah. I you know, really for the last 3, 4, 5 years have become very good about writing myself a real synopsis, which is how I typically will pitch to my editor anyway, and then going through and, you know, changes happen, but the structure of the book at least is in there. I know where I'm going.
Exactly. That helps so much. Yeah, I know I sort of use Freytag's pyramid to plot the climax and the denouement, you know, the different pieces that I know have to happen. Mm-hmm. And also I do, like you said, starting with a synopsis. I don't necessarily do pages and pages, but I start with the log line like a movie pitch.
Oh, I like
and then I write the jacket copy that'll go in the back of the book. And then I start writing the book so that the themes are always, I can always keep coming back to that and say, oh, don't wander off on this historical tangent. That's not what the book is about. It's about this.
This is cool, but maybe not for this book. We'll do that for something else.
We'll put that in the book club kid or whatever.
Exactly. Not to put you on the spot, but do you remember the log line that you started with for The Invisible Woman?
I know. I would have to read it.
No worries. That was a very, you know, out of left field question. So fair enough. we have a question from Dawn, and I'm so glad to see everybody asking questions. This is fantastic. Please do keep them coming. Dawn asks, did you always want to be a writer, and what other jobs have you had?
Yes, yes. So since I can hold a pen, I've always been writing something. It started with plays and bad poetry, and then angsty teenage novels, and now I've grown up, I guess, to angsty adult novels with Virginia. But also, the sidecar is I'm also a teacher. So my degree was in education and in literature, and I taught third grade for a number of years, first grade, and then when I started having my sons, I was writing when I wasn't taking care of them. So, but also in addition to that, I've also substitute taught over the years. Right now, I teach faith formation to young children going to be confirmed. So I'm always teaching in some capacity because I find if I only write, it drives me a little bit crazy. But
Sure.
it's too much in my head. I need the balance of interaction with humans also.
Are there things that you think that your career in teaching and in education have helped with your writing career?
Yes, absolutely. Because when I was learning to be a teacher and teaching children, they always talked about motivation. So at the beginning of each lesson, you would do something to get the attention of the children and then connect it to their prior knowledge. So I kind of use that model in my chapters, try to make the first sentence or two so that you have to read the next sentence. And then with Virginia Hall, trying to connect, she's not, as I said, not relatable, but emotion is relatable. So if we introduce fear or guilt or this, that's the prior knowledge that the reader needs to latch on and go forward with them. So yeah, teaching has been really helpful with that.
It's so interesting that you say that, because one of the things that, of course, I'm sitting there reading with my glass of wine on my sofa and thinking, God, this woman was just incredible. And in some ways, she is not relatable, but I never felt alienated from her. I always felt very connected to her while reading it. And I think it is that emotion and the fact that, sorry to gush about your book at you, but I think one of the things that really worked so well was I love seeing a woman portrayed who was tough and was difficult and spiny, but also, could cry and could scream and could laugh and could have those relationships with people. And it's quite clear that once her trust was earned, her loyalty ran very, very deep. And that did feel familiar and did feel very human and something I could connect to. So it's interesting that was such a part of trying to draw readers in chapter to chapter and make sure the story moved forward.
Oh, that's good to hear. Because it's hard to tell sometimes if it'll work, especially with someone like her. I imagined, she was encased in ice, and so I would be like chinking off here to sort of resurrect the woman inside. So, and that's, the book is set up that she's trying to find her identity under all of these false identities, some that are others have given her and others that she has created. So it's just a huge part of the process for her.
Yeah, no, it was really, really interesting seeing that unfold. We have more questions, always a good thing. Dawn also asks, have you let Virginia Hall go, or will you read the nonfiction book that came out after you were already done writing the book?
Oh, I've already read the biography. I'm obsessed with Virginia Hall. Whatever comes out about her, I will read it. If there's a movie, I will watch it. And I think there's a new book, A Call to Spy, came out earlier last year, and she's a character. And then there's one, Daisy Ridley has been tapped to play Virginia Hall as the lead in a movie based on a woman of no importance.
That's really interesting casting. That could work.
Yeah. Yeah, you get that Star Wars feeling, so.
And that kind of toughness, but also ability to convey emotion that way. That's really interesting.
Yeah, so it's in production. I'm not sure where it is, but no, I'll never be rid of her. I carry them with me always. I do have when I'm done with the book, I go visit the graveyard if I can for my characters, which I usually can. And she's buried not far from where I live. She's just outside of Baltimore. So yeah, that's a nice little way to make peace, but no, I'll never be rid of her.
I like it. I think that sounds like a good reason to stick with somebody. Certainly. Susan wants to know if you were a reader growing up, and she also asks what books inspired you as a child. I'm also a teacher, or was a teacher. She's retired now, and I love the world of kids' books and authors, especially those from my childhood.
Oh yes, I can remember pretty much the big read from every year of my life, starting with The Cat in the Hat when I was just young enough. But and then the stories that go with them. So my dad had an air freight company, and I remember one day he brought home a book that the cover had been ripped off, which now I know means it's been remaindered and sent back to the publisher, which is so sad. And it was James and the Giant Peach, and that started me on the Roald Dahl kick and going through all of those, and then the Chronicles of Narnia. Just one after another. I remember Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry when I was in middle school, which rocked my world. I didn't know anything about civil rights or the history of slavery until I read that. Beloved when I was in college. I think Beloved is a book that made me really fall in love with historical fiction, because when you're growing up, you're taught about wars, you're taught about slavery, how sad these things are. But in fiction, if you have a character, you can experience the emotion, and that helps you understand the history in a much deeper way than just the facts. So that's really where that came from me. But Charlotte's Web, huge. I used to read that out loud to my third graders, but I always had to make them read the end because I could still never get through without sobbing.
I have this very distinct memory of my fourth grade teacher reading another one of these Newbery Award, kind of that group of books, Where the Red Fern Grows.
Yeah.
To us, and just bawling at the end of this book, and all these fourth graders are sitting on the ground just crying their eyes out. And I even as a child thinking, this is really hard to read.
I know. I physically could not read the end of Charlotte's Web out loud. Still, I get emotional just thinking of the lines about the friend and the writer, and oh no. So
yeah. They're wonderful, wonderful books. Well, maybe in a related way, we have a question here. Oh, here we go. From Margie asking, have either of you ever thought about writing a children's book, either a history character or other fiction? Have you ever thought about maybe doing children's?
I wrote a children's book for a friend once as a gift with my sons. It was actually a friend whose daughter had died, and so we worked on this little booklet together. But I've never thought of an idea that I would send out, to the world. I'm open to writing anything. So, but no, I've never, if the idea came, I would go for it, but it hasn't yet appeared.
You never know what's going to be next around a publishing career, what's going to happen in 5 years, 10 years. Who knows?
Never say never. How about you? Have you ever thought about it?
Yeah, so I spent a little bit of time in the wilderness. I got an agent, and then we just couldn't sell a book of mine. The industry was changing, and I was writing historical romance at the time, and 50 Shades of Grey was really popular. And unfortunately, those two things really were not compatible in terms of publishing deals. So we talked about, what I was going to write next, and I wrote a couple of things, and one of them actually ended up selling and becoming a book that I did publish later on, which is, good advice to keep those books around because you never know what's going to happen.
Oh, yeah.
But, I was open to doing a lot of different things. And so we talked about potentially a children's book for me, more sort of middle grade historical books. I was a really big fan of the Dear America series when I was growing up, which were diaries of girls, during significant periods of history in the US. And so it kind of was an idea like that. And every once in a while, my agent and I will say, oh, maybe we should revive that project at some point. But unfortunately, we haven't had the opportunity to yet. So
yeah, there aren't enough hours in the day, but maybe one day.
Maybe one day. You never know. You never know. So we have a couple of questions around what is your next project, and if you can talk about it. I don't know if that's allowed or not.
I can, because my editor approved it and now I'm revising it. So I had to wait to get that. But yeah, so
that's the best news.
I know, it's such a relief. We're hoping to publish early next year, so maybe February of 22. And it's one of the women, when I started writing Virginia Hall's novel, I was going to put her with another SOE agent. And Virginia Hall's story became so large and she so much needed it to be about her, I put this other agent to the side. But I've never stopped thinking about her. I've never stopped dreaming about her. I felt like she was pursuing me. I had a dream one night where she said, "You've abandoned me." It was very tragic. But honestly, I can't write just about her because her story is a tragedy. And I was working on another book about another American woman, her name is Virginia, strangely, who helped smuggle pilots out of France in World War II. And she was interviewed about her time at Ravensbrück concentration camp and mentioned this other agent, who is Violet Jabo. The two of them were on the same work detail. They they were housed together and they had this friendship that developed there. And so I had to put them together. So now I've got two women. Their stories, they're very different women and do very different things in the war, but their stories do converge at Ravensbrück. So that'll be next year.
Oh, fantastic. I can't wait to read that.
Thank you.
I would love to also, not to put you on the spot, because I know whenever anybody asks me this, every book I've ever read goes out of my mind. But what are you reading right now and enjoying? Is there anything that you can recommend?
Yes, and I'm always reading books that are coming out. So I'm not going to say those because you won't remember them. I'll tell you what has recently come out that I've loved, and that is Jennifer Robson's Our Darkest Night, which is set in Italy in World War II. The Yellow Wife by Sadika Johnson, which is set in Richmond during the antebellum slave period. Fascinating and so moving, very moving. Those are my two of my recent historical favorites. Oh, and Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell, about Shakespeare's son who dies of the plague. And I'm not spoiling anything. She says right at the beginning that he dies of the plague. So
Right.
that's a more literary book, and it's phenomenal.
So we must have been reading the same things at the same time, because not only was Sadiqa and Jennifer have been recent guests on Ask an Author. So if you guys are watching and want to go back and watch those, if you look in the announcements of the Facebook group, you'll see those. I also read Hamnet. It was a Christmas present this year. It was named the Waterstones Book of the Year. So it is a beautiful binding over here, and I was given it for Christmas. I thought it was just fantastic, really, really good. And I've been telling everybody I can to read it, because it's beautifully written. It's multi-layered. It's just really excellent.
Yeah, that one might be, it's just everything, it's beautiful writing. It's a compelling story. It's something I knew a little bit about, but not a lot. So it really had everything.
Yeah, I think if you guys haven't read that, try to get your hands on it. Try to get your hands on all these books. They're absolutely fantastic. So I would love it if you could kind of wrap us up by telling people where they can find the book, and then also if they want to stay in touch with you, what are the best places to find you online?
Sure. And during these past few weeks, I've tried to make the rounds to as many independent booksellers as possible. And Bethany Beach Books has an enormous stash of signed books. I went there and I hand signed them, and they will ship them anywhere. They actually have a program where they're trying to ship to the 50 states, and they're at maybe state 28. So if you're from one of the other ones, I'm not sure exactly which. They have a map they're going by. So there's a lot there. There's a lot at Old Fox Books in Annapolis, Foxtail in Georgia, Warwick's in California. And then wherever books are sold, so however people like to read. And as for me, I spend my favorite social media is probably Instagram. I love the pictures. I like a book with a coffee cup next to it. There's nothing that makes me happier.
It's two of the things I love.
It's sort of a neutral environment, low stress. So that's where I like to be. But if anyone has questions that they didn't get to answer or talk about this time, my website has a contact form. And after this book is due, I will answer any email that comes through.
That's a very good caveat. You got to get the book done, and then you can follow up with the reader questions. Definitely.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's really been a pleasure to talk to you, and I really hope, based on the comments I'm seeing, people have really enjoyed this. But I really hope that as people read the book, they have as fantastic a time reading it as I did. So.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you having me so much. I was honored to see that that popped up. So thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you again. And there will be another Ask an Author coming up next week. So keep your eyes peeled, and we'll have more information on the Facebook group. Thank you, everybody. Bye.